When Clark Thompson stepped into a small medical clinic on the outskirts of New Orleans at dawn, after 11 months missing, he was barely recognizable, gaunt, ashen-skinned, clothes disheveled, and eyes wild with panic, like someone who had just escaped from a place that didn't belong to this world. The man who had once been a night shift Uber driver had vanished completely after his last ride, leaving his family to believe he was dead and his case filed away as a cold case. But the most terrifying thing wasn't Clark's emaciated condition or the silence that had stretched on for nearly a year. The most terrifying thing was what he began to reveal about those 11 months, about how he was held, how his will was broken, and about the people who still exist and operate in the shadows of a distorted belief right in the midst of modern society. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Late one night during the first weekend of early fall, New Orleans appeared in its familiar yet always faintly uneasy state, as streetlights stretched along St. Claude Avenue, reflecting off the still wet pavement from an afternoon rain, and the last patrons left the small bars in the Bywater neighborhood, leaving the city to those who worked the late shifts, like Clark Thompson. Clark, 32 years old, had started his shift at the beginning of the evening with near-mechanical regularity, checking his car, opening the Uber app, and slipping into the familiar rhythm of movement he had maintained for years, a schedule so consistent that his family always knew, barring anything unusual, he would be home before dawn. Clark lived alone in a small apartment, not far from the center, had no habit of lingering after work, and almost always answered calls or messages from family, even while driving, a habit that had become an unspoken assurance of his safety in their eyes. According to app data, that night's shift unfolded normally at first, with back-to-back rides taking Clark through familiar parts of the city, until he accepted a pickup request in Bywater, a pickup location that was far from unfamiliar and frequently appeared in his regular routes. In the first few minutes after accepting the ride, Clark's route still matched the paths he usually took, with no signs of hesitation or unusual deviation, but at an intersection not far from the pickup point, the car suddenly veered off the expected direction, a small adjustment just enough to be logged by the system, but not enough to immediately trigger any alerts. This change marked the last moment Clark left a clear trace in the data trail, because only minutes later, his active status on the app stopped abruptly, and all contact began to fall into silence. In the short time that followed, Clark's phone went unanswered, messages sent showed no signs of being read, and his lack of response became the first baffling thing for his family, who were accustomed to his punctuality and steady communication habits. At first, the silence was explained away as a technical glitch or an unexpectedly long ride, but as time passed, and the night gave way to early morning with still no reply, worry quickly replaced every normal assumption. Clark's family tried reaching him through every channel, direct calls, checking places he sometimes stopped after shifts, but nothing yielded results, and his absence began to loom as an unfillable gap in their familiar routine. When spontaneous efforts brought no leads and daylight had fully arrived, Clark's family had no choice but to accept that this was no ordinary delay. They contacted local police to report him missing, providing basic information about Clark, his work schedule, travel habits, and the last time he was recorded as active and normal. The initial report was received with the usual caution reserved for a missing person case of unknown cause, and from that moment, Clark Thompson was officially recorded as having vanished from the everyday life of New Orleans, leaving no note, no warning sign, only an unfinished night and a spreading unease within his family from the very first hours. Right after Clark Thompson's missing person report was filed, local police initiated the standard initial assessment process, in which the priority level was determined based on familiar factors such as age, daily routine, personal history, and circumstances of disappearance. In this case, because Clark was an adult with no history of medical conditions or risky behavior, the case was initially classified as one requiring monitoring but not yet considered the highest emergency situation. However, the complete absence of any contact for many consecutive hours, completely at odds with Clark's stable habits, compelled the on-duty officers to expand the scope of information intake, documenting the exact time of the family's last contact with him and the routes he typically drove during his night shifts. In parallel with the official process, Clark's family did not wait for results from a single direction. They quickly mobilized friends, co-workers, and acquaintances in the community for spontaneous searches, checking the roads Clark usually drove, parking lots, all-night gas stations, and the spots where he occasionally stopped for short breaks during shifts, all carried out in a state of tension and with little clear information. Small groups formed naturally, dividing up to canvass, post information on local community forums and social media, hoping someone had seen Clark or his car on the night he vanished. But these efforts only produced scattered responses that weren't enough to form a coherent picture. During this process, Uber was formally contacted and provided data related to Clark's account, including login times, the ride history from his final shift, and the last recorded location before his active status ceased, information that was expected to help narrow the search area. The data showed that Clark had accepted a legitimate ride, with an initial route consistent with his usual driving patterns, and no alerts had been sent from the app, no emergency button had been activated, and there was no indication of unauthorized access to the account, which only heightened the sense of ambiguity surrounding his disappearance. When this information was cross-checked against what family and friends provided, police found no clear contradictions strong enough to point to a specific scenario. No traffic accident reports matched the relevant timeframe, no emergency calls aligned with the incident, and no direct eyewitnesses confirmed any violent event. Initial checks of the routes showed no signs of collision, no abandoned vehicle, and no evidence that Clark had left the car in a state of panic, all of which made the hypothesis of a serious accident less convincing. At the same time, the lack of any signs of violence also made the possibility of an immediate attack less of a priority, at least in the earliest assessments, since there was no visual evidence suggesting Clark had been coerced or placed in immediate danger at the moment. Contact was lost. Faced with these fragmented facts, initial hypotheses were proposed cautiously, ranging from the possibility that Clark had encountered an unwanted personal issue, a technical malfunction causing prolonged loss of contact, or a decision to deviate from his usual routine for some undetermined reason. But none of these hypotheses was strong enough to be established as the official investigative focus. Meanwhile, Clark's family grew increasingly anxious over the slow pace of the search progress, because to them the prolonged silence was incompatible with his personality and lifestyle, and every passing hour intensified the feeling that waiting for more information might mean missing critical opportunities. Even so, within the framework of what could be verified at that point, police were still required to adhere to standard procedures, continuing to gather information, log calls from the community, and keep the case file open, as there was still no clear indication that a criminal act had occurred. And it was precisely this absence of specific leads that shaped the entire initial search phase into a tense, prolonged, and deeply uncertain process, where every effort unfolded in the shadow of unverified assumptions. As the first few days passed without bringing any specific leads, the search for Clark Thompson began to inevitably wind down, a process that unfolded quietly but unmistakably for both the police and his family, since all the initial expanded efforts had been deployed without yielding commensurate results. Key routes had been combed through multiple times, areas Clark frequently visited during his night shifts had been checked repeatedly, but no new data emerged strong enough to redirect the search, and the continued failure to locate his vehicle only made the scope of the investigation even more vague. Police kept the case file open, but in practice, resources allocated to the matter grew increasingly limited, as other priorities, with clearer evidence and more urgent demands for intervention, gradually took precedence in the schedules of the responsible units. Clark's family noticed this shift through the way update calls became less frequent, responses grew more repetitive, and familiar phrases like "no new information" appeared with growing regularity. Reflecting the reality, that his disappearance was steadily slipping out of the center of the system's attention. In parallel with the contraction of official search activity, the spontaneous efforts of family and friends also began to slow, not because they gave up hope, but because of the accumulated exhaustion after weeks without results, when every conceivable location had been checked, and every potential lead had led to a dead end. The fact that Clark and his vehicle remained completely untraceable became an insurmountable bottleneck: no car to follow for traces, no fixed location to narrow down, and no physical evidence strong enough to reconstruct a plausible scenario of what happened on the night he vanished. Local media, which had given the case considerable attention in the early days, gradually reduced coverage as no new developments emerged to report. Short news segments gave way to other stories, and Clark's image, once a constant feature on evening broadcasts, appeared less and less frequently. To the public, his disappearance gradually became just one of many unsolved cases, a lingering, unfinished story that faded without leaving a lasting mark. But to his family, this silence carried an entirely different weight, because each passing day without news only prolonged the state of suspension between hope and despair. When time measured in weeks shifted to months, internal police evaluations reached a procedural, but psychologically heavy conclusion. Clark's file needed to be moved to cold case status, a step that reflected the reality that every feasible investigative avenue in the initial phase had been exhausted without success. This decision did not mean the case was fully closed, but it marked a change in approach, from active searching to a mode of information retention and waiting for new leads, something Clark's family understood could stretch on indefinitely. The notification about transferring the file to cold case status was delivered cautiously, accompanied by formal assurances that the case would be reviewed if new information surfaced, but to his family, this was the moment when the simmering fear they had carried for so long became more concrete than ever. There was no official conclusion about whether Clark was still alive, or had met something serious, no clear answer to close a chapter in their lives, only a prolonged void filled with unanswered questions. Clark's family life was forced to continue in that state of uncertainty, where every strange phone call, every leaked tidbit on social media, or every report of an unidentified man found somewhere could rekindle the fragile hope that Clark still existed somewhere beyond their reach. While the official system had shifted to standby mode, his family lived in a different kind of time, one where the past of that missing night had never truly ended, and the future remained suspended, because no clear conclusion was strong enough for them to accept or let go. The labeling of the file as a cold case was therefore not just an administrative change, but a heavy psychological milestone, etching in the sense that Clark's disappearance had moved into a phase where his story was no longer driven by action and pursuit, but held in a prolonged state of waiting, silent, uncertain, and indefinite, a state his family had to confront every day without knowing when, or if ever, it would be replaced by a clear answer. 11 months after the night Clark Thompson disappeared, and his file was placed into prolonged waiting status, the silence that had seemed to become permanent was suddenly broken by an event no one in his family dared to imagine. On an early morning, a gaunt man with matted hair and beard, wrinkled clothes, and a staggering gait appeared at the door of a small medical clinic located outside the urban area of New Orleans. The on-duty staff initially recorded it as a case requiring urgent medical support, since the man showed clear signs of extreme exhaustion, but just a few minutes later, as he struggled in fragmented bursts to identify himself while barely controlling his breathing, a chain reaction of events began to unfold. Clark arrived with a car that was quickly identified as the vehicle associated with the disappearance nearly a year earlier, and the fact that this car appeared with him, neither dismantled nor completely destroyed, immediately pushed the situation beyond the scope of an ordinary emergency case. Clark's physical condition was assessed as serious, drastic weight loss compared to his previous medical records, darkened skin, abnormally rigid muscles, and signs indicating he had endured prolonged malnutrition, not for days or weeks, but long enough to weaken his entire mobility and reflexes. Throughout the initial intake process, Clark could barely maintain continuous communication. His eyes constantly darted around the room, lingering too long on irrelevant details, then startling at the smallest sounds, as if the surrounding space always held a threat that only he could perceive. When asked about the time that had passed since the night he vanished, Clark reacted with clear avoidance, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes falling into prolonged silence, and in the rare moments he tried to answer, his speech became disjointed, lacking any clear chronological order, leading medical staff to quickly realize this was not simply a physical issue. Faced with these abnormal signs, the clinic followed protocol by notifying local authorities, not as a coercive measure, but as a necessary step to ensure safety for both Clark and those around him. Since the sudden reappearance of someone long reported missing always raised questions beyond the capacity of a frontline medical facility. When police arrived, identification cross-checking happened swiftly, from physical characteristics to the accompanying vehicle, and within a short time, they confirmed that the man sitting on the hospital bed was indeed Clark Thompson, the person who had vanished from New Orleans nearly a year earlier without leaving any trace. This confirmation immediately changed the entire approach to the matter, because this was no longer a standalone emergency case, but the reappearance of an individual tied to a file already classified as a cold case, an occurrence rare enough to reactivate the attention of investigative units. During initial contact, police observed that Clark became particularly tense when asked sequential questions, such as where he had been or who he had interacted with during the intervening time, and his reactions did not resemble those of someone returning from a long trip or a voluntary absence, but rather those of someone who had just escaped a prolonged situation filled with pressure and danger. Clark repeatedly requested personal space, avoided eye contact, and displayed clear defensive reflexes when anyone approached too closely, signs that prompted police to adjust their approach, shifting from standard information verification to assessing potential criminal risk. The combination of his emaciated physical state, unstable psychological presentation, and reappearance with the once missing vehicle raised the possibility that Clark was not simply a returnee, but a victim who had just escaped a serious situation he was not yet ready or able to articulate. In that context, administrative procedures related to the old file were reactivated almost immediately, not through dramatic decision, but through the familiar chain of system actions, updating the case status, notifying relevant units, and reopening documents that had lain dormant for many months. Clark's family was contacted in a state of mingled joy and confusion, because the news that he was alive and had reappeared came alongside alarming descriptions of his condition, casting a shadow of fear over the joy of reunion, regarding what might have happened during the time he was gone. For the police, this reappearance did not mean closing a case. On the contrary, it opened an entirely new phase of the investigation, where old hypotheses had to be re-examined in light of fresh indicators, and the file once pushed into waiting status was now pulled back into the center of attention, not because of a chance lead, but because Clark's own return, in such terrible and unstable condition, had itself become the strongest evidence that his disappearance could not be explained by the harmless scenarios once considered. After Clark Thompson was admitted in a state of extreme exhaustion and instability, the next step was implemented cautiously but decisively. The official identity confirmation process aimed at ruling out any possibility of mistaken identity in a case that had already stretched on for so long and been filled with information gaps. Confirmation was first carried out through fingerprinting, with direct comparison against archived data in the administrative system and Clark's prior records. A decisive step because it allowed affirmation that the man who had just appeared was indeed the individual reported missing nearly a year earlier, rather than a case of mistaken identity or impersonation. The results matched completely, not only in the fingerprint pattern, but also in other biometric indicators on record, from facial features to distinctive identifying marks documented in the file, creating an objective chain of confirmation that could not be disputed. In parallel, data related to Clark's professional activity was also reviewed again, particularly his Uber profile, which stored account information, activity history, and internal identifying details that only the account holder could match precisely. This cross-check showed complete consistency between the man lying in the hospital bed and the Uber driver who had disappeared, from personal information and profile photo to minor details about work schedules, thereby further reinforcing the conclusion that Clark had truly returned after a prolonged period of absence. Once the technical confirmation steps were completed, Clark's family was invited in under circumstances that were both administrative and emotionally heavy, because although they had already been told he was alive, actually seeing the gaunt figure so far removed from the familiar image in their memory was still an unavoidable shock. The family's confirmation required little additional procedure, because the unmistakable traits in Clark's eyes, voice, and gestures, even though altered, were still sufficient to affirm he was the loved one they had waited for over many months in a state of uncertainty. From that point onward, Clark Thompson's identity was officially established in every respect, closing off any doubt about whether he was truly the missing person, while simultaneously opening up a new series of far more complex and troubling questions. Throughout the confirmation process, Clark cooperated only at the minimum necessary level, allowing procedures to be carried out but not voluntarily providing additional information, and when asked about what had happened during the time he was missing, he offered only brief incomplete responses, or complete avoidance, as though reorganizing the stream of memories was a task beyond his current capacity. This silence was not defiant or obstructive. It resembled a form of self-protection, a natural reflex of someone who had just endured a prolonged period under extreme stress, where speaking out might mean having to confront experiences that body and mind were still not ready to process. To the investigators, Clark's demeanor was not seen as a sign of non-cooperation, but as an element to be considered within the overall context, because his failure to provide detailed explanations right away did not diminish the significance of what had already been objectively confirmed through data. On the contrary, the combination of a firmly established identity and a victim who could not or would not explain the period of disappearance only heightened the seriousness of the case, making initial hypotheses of a harmless disappearance increasingly untenable. At this point, Clark's file was officially updated, not merely as a missing person case closed by the subject's return, but shifted to an entirely different legal and operational status. The responsible units began re-examining all data under a new lens, where the possibility of criminal conduct was no longer vague speculation, but a priority investigative direction, based on what had been confirmed about Clark's physical condition, psychological state, and circumstances of reappearance. The decision to pivot toward a criminal investigation was not made hastily or emotionally, but resulted from the successive chain of confirmations, showing that Clark's disappearance and return did not fit any of the voluntary or random scenarios previously considered. Once Clark Thompson's identity was fully and indisputably confirmed, the focus of the case no longer rested on whether he was truly the missing person, but shifted to clarifying what had occurred during the time he was gone, and the causes behind the state of depletion he brought back with him upon returning. In that context, Clark was transferred from the initial medical clinic to a facility with greater capacity for in-depth evaluation, where the medical team proceeded with admission and conducted a comprehensive full-body checkup to precisely determine the extent of his physical injuries and overall health after nearly a year of absence. The initial assessment process quickly revealed that Clark was not simply in a state of ordinary fatigue or general weakness, but was in a condition of severe emaciation, with vital signs fluctuating abnormally, and a clearly deteriorated physical state compared to his previously archived medical records. His weight had dropped to an alarming level, significant muscle mass had been lost, subcutaneous fat had almost completely disappeared, reflecting a prolonged period of nutritional deficiency rather than the result of a short phase of inadequate eating. Blood tests showed electrolyte imbalances, deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, along with metabolic disturbances consistent with long-term restricted food intake, a situation that would be highly unlikely if Clark had simply voluntarily left his everyday life for a brief period. In addition, doctors noted signs of functional decline across multiple organ systems, from cardiovascular to digestive, indicating that his body had been forced to adapt in an environment of prolonged deprivation, where maintaining even minimal health had become a constant effort rather than a normal state. During more detailed examinations, the medical team discovered multiple old wounds on Clark's body in various stages of healing, some fully healed but leaving scars, others still showing mild inflammation, distributed unevenly and inconsistent with a single accident. Old bruises appeared in locations typically unrelated to ordinary household accidents, while some long narrow scars suggested impact from hard objects or tools applied with deliberate intent rather than random collisions. Orthopedic specialists and forensic experts were consulted to evaluate the nature of these injuries, and preliminary conclusions indicated they were consistent with a scenario of repeated abuse over an extended period, rather than a single violent event or an unfortunate accident. Injuries particularly around the wrists, ankles and lower back drew special attention, because their shape and positioning suggested prolonged restraint in painful positions or restricted movement for certain periods, even though there were no clear signs of physical restraint devices such as handcuffs or chains. When these findings were cross-referenced with Clark's prior medical history, doctors gradually ruled out the possibility that the wounds could have resulted from a serious traffic accident or an accumulation of minor incidents, since there were no corresponding hospital admission or treatment records during the time he was missing, and the pattern of injuries did not match typical trauma models seen in those situations. Furthermore, signs of muscle atrophy and soft tissue damage indicated that Clark had endured harsh living conditions with limited access to basic medical care, further reinforcing the assessment that he had not been free to choose his circumstances for a prolonged time. Throughout the evaluation process, Clark was asked to cooperate only at the minimum level necessary for examinations, and although he did not object to the medical procedures, his tense demeanor and avoidance reactions, when certain body areas were examined, showed that memories tied to pain remained very vivid enough to trigger defensive reflexes, even in what was supposed to be a safe environment. Clinical psychologists working alongside the physical treatment team noted that these reactions were not exaggerated or fabricated, but consistent with patterns commonly seen in victims who had experienced forced confinement and prolonged violence, where the body retains the memory of trauma even when the conscious mind is not yet ready to confront it. From the synthesis of clinical data, lab results and expert evaluations, the medical team reached a conclusion of major significance for the entire case. Clark's condition could not be explained by ordinary accident scenarios or a period of self-neglect, but clearly showed signs of having been held in conditions of deprivation, accompanied by systematic physical abuse. This conclusion was not reached hastily, but was based on the consistency across multiple independent indicators, from prolonged malnutrition and repetitive pattern injuries to the reasonable elimination of non-criminal causes. When the official medical report was finalized and forwarded to the relevant authorities, it served not only as a healthcare document, but also became a crucial piece in reframing the perception of the case, because for the first time, objective evidence from Clark's own body pointed to his disappearance being linked to a prolonged process of confinement and abuse, a reality that forced every hypothesis to be re-evaluated in light of what his body had endured throughout that unexplained period. After the physical medical evaluations established that Clark Thompson had endured a prolonged period of confinement and abuse, a team of clinical psychologists was assigned to conduct an in-depth assessment to determine the extent of his psychological trauma and the impact of psychological factors during the time he was missing. A step considered essential not only for the treatment process, but also to gain a clearer understanding of the context of what had happened. Right from the initial contact sessions, the specialists noted that Clark met all the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, with clear manifestations such as persistently heightened vigilance, exaggerated startle reflexes in response to unexpected auditory stimuli, severe sleep disturbances, and periods of dissociation, accompanied by profound mental fatigue. These symptoms did not appear in isolation, but formed a stable pattern, reflecting that Clark had lived in an environment where any sense of safety had been stripped away for a long time, forcing his mind to maintain a constant state of defense, even when direct threats were no longer present. Particularly noteworthy was Clark's reaction whenever the specialists, intentionally or unintentionally, mentioned concepts related to religion, faith, or closed communal living arrangements. Immediately, his stress level rose noticeably, shown through changes in breathing, body withdrawal gestures, and a tendency to avoid eye contact. These reactions went far beyond ordinary discomfort, indicating that religious or ideological elements had once played a central role in his traumatic experience, strong enough to automatically trigger emotional memories that Clark could not control. When asked to speak about the period of his disappearance, Clark frequently displayed systematic avoidance behavior, changing the subject, giving short answers, or falling into prolonged silence, not because he denied that anything had happened, but because reliving the events appeared to cause immediate psychological overload. The specialists observed that Clark's memories of this period were not completely erased, but were stored in a fragmented way, with disjointed pieces surfacing at unwanted moments, rather than in a coherent narrative he could actively control. This phenomenon aligned with cases of prolonged trauma, where the brain employs dissociation as a self-protective mechanism against overwhelming psychological pressure, while simultaneously making it extremely difficult to recount events in the early stages of recovery. In addition, Clark showed very clear conditioned fear responses. Certain sounds, smells, or specific images, even though harmless in the current context, were still sufficient to provoke strong stress reactions, as if they were tied to repeated negative experiences during his confinement. These responses occurred consistently, showing they were not random, but the result of forced learning in a controlled environment, where fear was used as a tool to maintain compliance. The psychologists paid particular attention to how Clark reacted in situations involving choice, as he often displayed hesitation or excessive anxiety, even with simple decisions, a sign that his sense of autonomy had been eroded over a long period, consistent with patterns of prolonged ideological coercion. Suspicion that Clark had been subjected to an imposed system of beliefs or mandatory rules of living was further reinforced when he showed a tendency toward self-censoring his speech, as though he still feared consequences from saying the wrong thing or thinking differently, even when no direct authority figure was present to monitor him. The specialists noted that this was a common manifestation in victims who had lived in tightly controlled ideological environments, where punishment operated not only on a physical level, but was internalized into self-sustaining psychological barriers. Throughout the assessment process, Clark showed no signs of fabricating or exaggerating symptoms. On the contrary, many of his reactions occurred unconsciously, before he could realize and attempt to conceal them, further affirming the authenticity of his trauma manifestations. From a professional standpoint, the clinical psychologists concluded that Clark's condition could not be explained merely by the shock of a single event, but reflected a prolonged ordeal in a tightly controlled environment, where fear, isolation, and ideological imposition were used in tandem to maintain power. This conclusion carried significant weight, as it not only guided the long-term treatment plan for Clark, but also provided a consistent psychological framework that aligned with what had already been documented in his physical medical records, forming a comprehensive picture of the extent of the damage he had endured. In that context, the suspicion that Clark had been a victim of prolonged ideological coercion was no longer vague speculation, but became a hypothesis with clear clinical grounding, based on the compatibility between his symptoms, behavioral responses, and established patterns of psychological trauma documented in prior cases of confinement and mind control. When the medical reports and psychological evaluations were completed and forwarded to the authorities, the entire approach to Clark Thompson's case underwent a fundamental shift, because these conclusions showed that his disappearance could no longer be regarded as a missing person case of unknown cause, but instead carried all the hallmarks of a serious, prolonged criminal act. On that basis, federal authorities were brought in to assist with the investigation, and the involvement of the FBI was not merely symbolic or procedural. It reflected an assessment that the case extended beyond the scope of a single local jurisdiction, both in duration and in nature. After reviewing the entire existing file, from the initial missing person data to the results of the medical and psychological examinations, the case was officially reclassified as one of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, a classification with major legal significance because it allowed for expanded investigative jurisdiction, mobilization of interagency resources, and application of legal frameworks appropriate to prolonged and organized criminal conduct. This reclassification was not based on a single detail, but on the convergence of multiple consistent factors, including the extended duration of the disappearance, the severe state of emaciation upon reappearance, the signs of physical abuse, and the psychological manifestations consistent with a forcibly controlled environment. In that context, the focus of the investigation was clearly redefined, not around the question of where Clark had gone during the time he was missing, but on clarifying the circumstances under which he was taken, held and controlled, who was behind it, and by what means. Due to the absence of an initial crime scene, and the lack of direct physical evidence from the period when Clark vanished, the victim's account became the central pillar of the investigative process, but the approach to this account was structured cautiously, methodically, and grounded in expert understanding of trauma, to avoid causing further harm to Clark, while ensuring the reliability of the information gathered. Specially trained investigators worked alongside psychological experts to design appropriate contact sessions, in which the goal was not to force Clark to recount his entire experience in a seamless narrative, but to document specific verifiable pieces of information, from how he was initially approached, the characteristics of the environment where he was held, to the forms of control he had to endure. Through preliminary analysis of this information, investigators quickly recognized that what Clark described did not bear the features of an impulsive or lone perpetrator crime, but reflected a systematic structure of control, where rules, punishments, and methods of coercion were applied consistently over a long period. These characteristics, when placed in the context of similar cases previously documented, reinforced the assessment that this was an organized crime, even though the scale and form of the organization remained unclear at that point. The concept of organization in this case did not necessarily mean a vast network, but could refer to a closed group operating under its own principles, tight enough to maintain control over a victim without requiring constant overt violence. Evaluating the case in this direction allowed authorities to gradually rule out simpler scenarios, such as a random motivated kidnapping, while focusing on identifying connections, behavioral patterns, and identifying markers of a prolonged control system. On that foundation, a new investigative direction was built, in which hypotheses were prioritized according to their fit with the existing data, rather than the chronological sequence of the disappearance. This approach emphasized identifying structural elements, such as victim selection methods, mechanisms for maintaining compliance, and signs indicating the existence of a consistent ideology or control framework, factors capable of simultaneously explaining both Clark's physical and psychological condition upon his return. The FBI's involvement also meant access to federal data sources for cross-referencing, from reports on similar closed groups with comparable activities to missing persons cases with matching characteristics, even though at that time, no conclusions had been reached about direct connections. What mattered was that the investigation was systematically restructured, moving away from the passive reactive state of the cold case phase, and shifting to a proactive process of hypothesis building based on clinical evidence, behavioral analysis, and victim statements. Throughout the activation of the criminal investigation, the authorities maintained the necessary caution, avoiding hasty statements or unverified assumptions, because they clearly understood that Clark's case was not simply the story of one individual who disappeared and returned, but a complex matter requiring close integration of criminal investigation, psychological analysis, and systematic behavioral assessment. Accurately determining the true nature of the case was decisive, because it reshaped the entire investigative approach, from information gathering methods to resource organization and allocation, in order to move the matter out of prolonged ambiguity and place it within a consistent legal and operational framework, where the data no longer existed in isolation, but were examined as interconnected parts of a tightly linked system. On the basis of officially classifying the case as kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, the investigative team carried out a key step in parallel with taking statements, the forensic examination of the vehicle Clark Thompson had used on the night he disappeared and driven when he reappeared, since this was the only direct physical link connecting the two most critical points of the case. The vehicle was taken to a specialized examination area, where forensic technicians conducted a thorough inspection of both the exterior and interior following standard protocol, to determine whether the vehicle had ever been used as a living space, a means of forced transport, or a site of violent acts. Initial examination results showed no signs that the car had served as a long-term confinement space for Clark, no traces of habitation, no characteristic odors associated with a person being locked in an enclosed space, and no evidence of modifications to the vehicle for purposes of imprisonment. The interior remained relatively intact, consistent with normal use as a transportation vehicle for most of its time, which helped rule out the hypothesis that Clark had been held inside the car, or that the vehicle had been central to the confinement process. However, investigators' attention quickly shifted to the trunk area, where while there were no signs of habitation, there were items that did not fit with Clark's ordinary personal or professional purposes. These items were arranged haphazardly, without careful concealment, but were immediately noticeable due to their form and the symbols attached to them. Among the items discovered were objects with clear ritualistic characteristics, including hand-carved symbols, items used for ceremonial or faith-demonstrating activities, along with some handwritten documents repeating concepts of obedience, purification, and control of personal behavior. These objects did not immediately match any widely recognized mainstream belief system, but bore features commonly seen in closed groups with their own ideological structures, where symbols and rituals serve as tools to reinforce power. When informed of the preliminary examination results, Clark confirmed that the items in the trunk were not his personal belongings from before the disappearance, but things he had taken during his escape, not with the intent to use them, but as a survival reflex to retain evidence of the environment in which he had been held. According to Clark's confirmation, taking these items was not a premeditated decision, but occurred in a state of panic, when he realized that if he left empty-handed, he might never be able to prove what he had endured. This confirmation was carefully documented, because it explained why cult-like and ritualistic items appeared in Clark's vehicle without any indication that he had voluntarily participated in related activities. Investigators assessed that the presence of these items in the trunk did not contradict the medical and psychological conclusions. On the contrary, it added an important layer of physical evidence supporting the hypothesis that Clark had been held in a highly ideologically controlled environment. Each item was collected, photographed, its discovery location recorded, and packaged according to proper chain of custody procedures to preserve integrity for future forensic analysis and comparison. Specialists were called in for a preliminary evaluation of the nature of the symbols and documents, not to immediately conclude their origin or specific ideology, but to determine whether they matched any group or operational pattern already recorded in existing databases. The absence of habitation traces in the trunk reinforced the assessment that Clark had not been confined in his own vehicle, while also eliminating certain extreme scenarios that could have misdirected the investigation. At the same time, the presence of ritualistic items opened a new axis of analysis, focused on the confinement environment outside the vehicle. The entire vehicle examination process was conducted in close coordination between investigative and forensic units, with the objective not only to determine the vehicle's role in the case, but also to preserve every possible physical trace that could aid in reconstructing the context in which Clark had been placed. Once the examination was completed, the vehicle was sealed along with all collected evidence, becoming an inseparable part of the criminal investigation file, where every detail, even if it did not directly point to a location or perpetrator identity, still held value in establishing the nature of the confinement environment and the methods of control Clark had been forced to endure. After the physical evidence from the vehicle and trunk was sealed, the focus of the investigation returned to Clark Thompson's statements, which were collected in short, tightly controlled phases regarding duration and intensity, to avoid re-triggering trauma while maximizing the accuracy of the information. Clark did not recount his story in a seamless narrative from the start, but through gradually pieced together fragments of memory, with each session focusing on only one specific slice of the experience, from the initial approach to the moment he escaped. According to Clark's account, everything began during his final ride on the night he disappeared, when Isaac Thorne approached him, no differently from an ordinary passenger, polite in appearance, showing no overt threat, and deliberately expressing interest in Clark's personal life throughout the trip. Isaac asked numerous questions centered on feelings of loneliness, life purpose, and the mental exhaustion of night shift driving, questions that seemed harmless on the surface, but were skillfully arranged to create a false sense of empathy. Clark described that, in a moment of lowered guard, he was offered a drink that Isaac had brought along under the pretext of sharing, and within just a few minutes, a wave of dizziness set in rapidly, his consciousness fading before he completely lost the ability to resist. When he regained awareness, Clark realized he was in an entirely unfamiliar space, stripped of free movement, and placed in isolation, where Isaac no longer played the role of a passenger, but assumed absolute control. According to Clark, the initial phase of confinement did not involve overt violence, but focused on undermining perception through prolonged lectures about salvation, purification, and the abandonment of personal ego to achieve a higher state of existence, all presented as an opportunity rather than coercion. However, when Clark showed doubt and resistance, refusing to participate in rituals and rejecting the imposed rules of conduct, the surrounding environment quickly shifted from persuasion to systematic punishment. Clark described being subjected to food restriction, prolonged isolation, and various forms of physical and psychological torture aimed at breaking his will to resist, with fear used as the central tool to reshape behavior. Through his statements, investigators were able to clearly analyze the stages of control Clark endured, beginning with approach and the building of false trust, followed by isolation from the outside world, then the imposition of ideology, through repetition and punishment, and finally, the maintenance of compliance by making the victim self-monitor their own thoughts and actions. Clark stated that throughout his confinement, he was forced to participate in coerced rituals, not out of belief, but to avoid more severe consequences, and this very process made the boundary between resistance and survival increasingly fragile. Regarding the escape plan, Clark described it not as a spontaneous act, but as the result of many months of silent observation and information gathering, as he gradually identified gaps in the control system, moments of lax supervision, and Isaac's repetitive habits. He took advantage of a rare moment when attention was diverted to break through spatial boundaries, while also taking along certain ritualistic items, not to use them, but as tangible proof of what he had endured, because Clark was fully aware that without physical evidence, his words might be doubted or dismissed. Clark described carrying these items as an instinctive act, driven by the fear that his story would be erased or regarded as delusional, and that only specific objects tied to the confinement environment could help him prove that the control he suffered was real and systematic. Clark's entire account, though delivered in fragmented and difficult pieces, showed high consistency when cross-referenced with the collected medical, psychological and physical evidence, forming a narrative structure, not reliant on fleeting emotion, but grounded in repeated details and internal logic. Investigators noted that Clark did not seek to dramatize his victim role, nor did he offer sensational descriptions beyond what was necessary. Instead, he focused on presenting what he remembered in a cautious and restrained manner, an element that further bolstered the reliability of his statements. Through this statement-taking process, the picture of how Clark was approached, confined, controlled, and ultimately escaped gradually became clear, not as a single subjective story, but as a structured sequence of events reflecting the operation of a control system designed to break individual will and maintain absolute power over those who fell under its influence. From Clark Thompson's statements, and the evidence seized from the trunk of the car, the effort to trace the group behind the confinement began to be implemented, in the direction of analyzing the ideological structure and organization, rather than focusing solely on a single individual. Specialists were mobilized to evaluate each ritualistic item, from hand-carved symbols, documents repeating slogans about purification and obedience, to tools used for highly performative rituals, with the goal of determining whether these elements matched any recorded belief system or model of a closed group. The analysis results showed that the evidence did not belong to any mainstream religion or widely recognized offshoot, but bore the characteristics of a self-established ideological group, where symbols were created to foster a sense of exclusivity and separation from the outside world. The content of the documents emphasized severing old social ties, demanding absolute submission to the leader, and viewing resistance as a manifestation of impurity that must be punished, a pattern consistent with closed groups operating on mind control. On the basis of this physical evidence, investigators expanded information gathering by reviewing prior reports on self-proclaimed religious communities that operated covertly and showed signs of isolating members, focusing on groups with scattered but persistent presence in the area and surrounding regions. Through data cross-referencing, a small group gradually came into focus, one that was not officially registered as a religious organization, had no stable public meeting place, and primarily recruited members through personal approaches, exploiting temporary relationships and the vulnerable circumstances of targets. The collected information showed that this group operated with a clear hierarchical structure, with one individual at the center responsible for interpreting doctrine, making decisions, and assigning tasks, while the others maintained daily activities, monitoring, and enforcing internal discipline. This structure explained how control could be sustained over a long period without the need for frequent overt violence, because obedience was internalized through fear and psychological dependency. When investigators compared Clark's description of the person who approached and controlled him with the gathered data, one name emerged with a high degree of match in behavior, role, and method of approach: Isaac Thorne. Scattered information about Isaac showed that he had appeared in various contexts under changing aliases, maintained no stable occupation, and frequently targeted individuals showing signs of social isolation or personal crisis, precisely matching the grooming pattern Clark had described. Identifying Isaac Thorne was not based on a single detail, but resulted from layering multiple sources of information, from the victim's statements and evidence analysis to cross-referencing organizational markers and the power structure of this closed group. Through this, Isaac was identified as the central figure holding the role of leader, the one who established the ideology, directly selected and controlled victims, and maintained power through a combination of spiritual manipulation and physical punishment. Pinpointing the primary suspect in this direction allowed authorities to shift focus from searching for a specific confinement location to clarifying the group's network of relationships and activities, because the nature of the crime did not lie in a fixed space, but in the control system that Isaac had built and sustained. The consistency between the identified cult-like structure and what Clark endured reinforced the assessment that this was not an impulsive act or the behavior of a lone deviant, but the manifestation of a closed organizational model where absolute power was concentrated in a single leader. Once Isaac Thorne was clearly identified in that role, the investigation file gained not only a specific suspect, but also a clear analytical framework for understanding how this group operated, recruited, and maintained control, providing a solid foundation for the operational steps needed to establish the criminal responsibility of the individuals and organization behind Clark Thompson's prolonged confinement. After Isaac Thorne was identified as the leader directly responsible for controlling and confining Clark Thompson, the examination of the confinement site was carried out with a high degree of caution, because this was not a traditional holding facility, but a space designed to conceal criminal activity through outward normalcy. The location identified was in a remote area, isolated from heavily trafficked roads, far enough to avoid attention, but not so far as to raise suspicion about regular access, reflecting a deliberate choice to balance isolation with the group's ability to sustain activities. When authorities approached the site, the first thing noted was the absence of familiar signs of a confinement place, such as sturdy fences, bars, heavy locks, or overt security measures. Instead, It was a structure with a simple exterior blending into the surrounding environment, not creating a sense of control to outsiders. Inside, the spatial layout showed a clear division between common living areas, isolation zones and spaces for rituals, arranged not according to usual criteria of comfort or efficiency, but according to behavioral and psychological control. Narrow passageways, limited lighting and layouts that segmented sightlines created a sense of unstable orientation, making it difficult for those inside to form a clear perception of the overall space, a factor contributing to prolonged dependency and disorientation. The lack of clear physical barriers did not mean freedom, because investigators noted that the space was designed to make leaving a psychologically difficult decision, with every exit linked to feelings of surveillance, punishment, or unforeseeable consequences. During the examination, many signs indicated that this place had been used to maintain control and torture not through direct violence, but through subtle repetitive methods, consistent with the injuries documented on Clark's body. Wall and floor surfaces in some areas showed wear inconsistent with ordinary activity, concentrated in narrow zones where a person might be forced to stand or kneel for extended periods, while small dimly lit rooms had relatively soundproof characteristics, suitable for prolonged isolation aimed at causing mental exhaustion. Some rudimentary items were found that did not resemble obvious torture tools, but showed signs of repeated use, indicating they were employed as means of controlled pain infliction, enough to sustain fear without leaving acute, easily detectable injuries. Investigators also noted the presence of ritualistic elements in central areas, from symbols to spatial arrangements, matching the evidence seized from Clark's vehicle, showing unity between the confinement environment and the imposed ideology. When cross-referencing the scene with Clark's statements, many key details were confirmed, from the locations of rooms where he was held, the use of lighting to distort time sense, to the areas he described as sites of rituals and mental punishment forms. This match not only reinforced the reliability of his statements, but also allowed reconstruction of how the space operated as a comprehensive control tool, where victims were stripped of the ability to discern boundaries between safety and danger. Personal living signs at the site were almost non-existent, no personalized belongings or traces of private life, which aligned with the model of a closed communal residence, where individual identity was blurred and replaced by a submissive role in the overall structure. The examination team also noted that the absence of traditional physical restraints might make the place seem non-criminal at first glance, but when placed in the context of statements and medical conclusions, it was precisely the sophistication in spatial design that was the key factor, enabling prolonged confinement to occur without attracting attention. Every site detail was documented, measured and diagrammed carefully, not to seek a single decisive piece of evidence, but to build an overall picture of how control had been implemented through space, lighting, layout and rituals. Through the examination process, the confinement site was established not only as a place where Clark was physically held, but as a closed system where control was maintained through a combination of environment, ideology, and fear, matching in a disturbingly consistent way with what had been recorded in his psychological and medical files. From the site examination and cross-referencing with Clark Thompson's statements, investigators were able to reconstruct quite clearly the confinement mechanism he had endured, a mechanism not based on direct physical imprisonment, but on restructuring the victim's entire life, according to a strictly controlled, forced daily schedule. Clark described how each of his days was broken down into fixed time slots, from wake-up time, meals, labor, to doctrinal gatherings, all decided externally, with no allowance for any flexibility or personal choice. This time control played a key role, because it eroded the sense of natural rhythm, gradually causing the victim to lose the ability to track days, months, and the passage of time, an important factor in maintaining personal identity. Within that schedule framework, punishments were applied not only as disciplinary measures, but as an inseparable part of the doctrine, where pain was interpreted as the path to purification and salvation. Clark stated that these punishments were not always overtly violent, but were often presented as the inevitable consequence of lacking faith or insufficient obedience, leading the victim to gradually accept them as part of the order, rather than as an act of violation. Punishment could involve prolonged isolation, food restriction, or being forced to perform repetitive rituals to the point of exhaustion, all aimed at breaking psychological resistance rather than causing immediate physical harm. Over time, this mechanism created a dangerous loop in which the victim learned to adjust behavior to avoid pain while internalizing the group's imposed norms as a survival strategy. The breaking of will was achieved through a combination of coerced faith and conditioned fear, where every difficulty, pain, or punishment was tied to the message that it resulted from a lack of belief, while absolute obedience would bring safety and meaning. Clark described that during the periods of greatest exhaustion, the boundary between genuinely believing and pretending to believe became blurred, because outwardly accepting the doctrine was sometimes the only way to reduce pressure and avoid harsher forms of punishment. This very ambiguity caused the victim to gradually lose the ability to distinguish their own thoughts from imposed ideas, a classic sign of prolonged ideological coercion. What was particularly noteworthy was that the entire confinement mechanism was maintained without the need for chains or obvious physical barriers, because control had been internalized from external to within the victim's mind. Clark stated that even when no one was directly supervising him, he still behaved according to the imposed rules, because the fear of consequences and the sense of being watched had become part of his perception. This self-monitoring was the key factor that sustained the confinement over a long period without requiring constant violence, while also reducing the risk of external detection. Investigators assessed that this mechanism was especially dangerous because it made it difficult for the victim to even perceive they were being held captive, especially when the control was disguised under the guise of spiritual guidance and community. In terms of long-term psychological impact, experts determined that living under such a control system for an extended time had left deep wounds on Clark, not only at the level of immediate trauma, but also in his ability to make decisions, build trust, and establish personal boundaries. The avoidance reflexes, conditioned fears, and tendency toward excessive self-control of behavior were seen as direct consequences of this confinement mechanism, indicating that Clark's recovery would not only be a process of physical healing, but also a long journey to reassert personal autonomy. From an investigative perspective, understanding the confinement mechanism not only helped clarify what Clark had gone through, but also allowed authorities to assess the sophistication and danger of the control model that Isaac Thorne had built, a model capable of sustaining prolonged confinement and abuse without requiring easily recognizable signs of violence, thereby underscoring the severity of the criminal conduct, not only in its consequences for the victim, but in the very method used to strip away human freedom and will. From the reconstruction of the confinement mechanism that Clark Thompson endured, investigators and behavioral experts conducted an in-depth analysis of Isaac Thorne's criminal tactics to clarify how a single individual could recruit, control, and sustain a victim's dependency over a long period without requiring constant overt violence. The recruitment method was identified as the first and decisive step in which Isaac actively targeted individuals with psychological or social vulnerabilities, such as isolation, mental fatigue, or a sense of being lost in life, and Clark was a typical example, working long night shifts, having limited social connections, and frequently facing feelings of emptiness. Isaac did not approach victims with threats or immediate coercion, but built an image of friendliness, empathy, and apparent genuine concern for the target's inner life, creating a false sense of safety before gradually steering conversations toward themes of meaning, salvation, and personal rebirth. The psychological poisoning strategy was implemented subtly, not through a single message, but through the repeated reinforcement of directive ideas, causing the victim to gradually doubt the value of their former life and begin to see the belief system Isaac presented as an escape. Clark described how Isaac's initial words always carried an element of choice and encouragement, but were designed to plant seeds of doubt, leading the victim to question themselves and thereby become more open to external guidance. When the approach shifted to control, any sign of non-compliance was interpreted as evidence of impurity or lack of faith, and it was at this point that punishment was introduced as a tool to reinforce power. Forms of punishment did not necessarily involve direct violence, but were often a combination of prolonged isolation, deprivation of basic needs, and sustained psychological pressure, enough to create an association in the victim's mind between pain and resistant behavior. Over time, the victim learned to avoid punishment by adjusting behavior, not out of belief, but out of fear, and this very fear gradually became the foundation for obedience. Control was maintained by linking faith to safety, while associating doubt with pain, creating an effective psychological reward and punishment system that did not require constant supervision. Isaac reinforced his authority by positioning himself as the sole intermediary between the victim and salvation, making every choice, thought, and action subject to evaluation through the lens of the doctrine he established. Clarke stated that even in the absence of Isaac's direct presence, the feeling of being judged, and the fear of consequences, still governed his behavior, demonstrating the depth to which the control mechanism had been internalized. From an analytical perspective, this criminal tactic was especially dangerous because it blurred the line between voluntary and coerced participation, making it difficult for the victim to recognize they were being harmed, while creating a profound psychological dependency that could persist even after escaping the confinement environment. The combination of selective recruitment, psychological poisoning, systematic punishment, and belief-based control revealed a calculated, non-impulsive criminal model designed to sustain long-term power with low risk to the perpetrator. Investigators assessed that the danger of this tactic lay not only in its capacity to inflict severe harm on an individual, but also in its potential to be repeated with other victims, if not stopped, because a control model based on ideology and fear could be flexibly applied in various contexts without being easily detected. It was precisely the sophistication and concealability of this method that made Isaac Thorne's conduct particularly dangerous, not only because of the consequences for Clark Thompson, but because it represented a form of crime where traces of violence were not always visible, yet the destructive impact on human freedom and dignity was far deeper and more enduring than in ordinary cases of coercion. After the criminal tactics and control structure were clarified, the file on Isaac Thorne was completed through a series of tightly planned operational activities, beginning with determining the timing, location, and method of arrest to minimize the possibility of the subject manipulating psychology or endangering others. Isaac's arrest was carried out based on a combination of Clark Thompson's statements, ritualistic physical evidence, movement data, and information gathered during the tracing of the closed group, allowing authorities to approach the subject in a proactive state, with control of the space and all potential communication channels cut off. During interrogation, Isaac displayed a calculated, calm demeanor, frequently using abstract language, and reframing his actions as voluntary choices made by others, evading acknowledgement of power and personal responsibility by emphasizing faith, the path to enlightenment, and inner freedom. This tactic was noted by investigators as a consistent part of Isaac's manipulation pattern, where language was used to blur the line between coercion and choice, while shifting the burden of responsibility onto the victim. Investigation of Isaac's personal background revealed a long-standing pattern of fragmented and unstable living over many years, with frequent changes of residence, severance of long-term relationships, and appearances in various small spiritual or quasi-religious communities, where his role grew increasingly central. Although no official record of serious prior criminal offenses existed, Isaac's behavioral history showed a troubling series of indicators, including tendencies toward control in personal relationships, high persuasive ability, and an obsession with shaping others' beliefs. People who had interacted with Isaac described him as an individual with considerable charisma, skilled at exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, and reacting intensely when his authority was challenged, a trait consistent with the leader role in a closed structure. The formation of the cult-like group led by Isaac did not occur at a single specific moment, but developed gradually from small gatherings where he acted as a spiritual guide, step by step constructing a distinct ideology based on separation from society and absolute submission. This ideology was not presented as a complete religion, but as a flexible set of truths, allowing Isaac to adjust doctrine according to control needs, while positioning himself as the only one capable of correct interpretation. Violence within this system was not displayed as an end in itself, but normalized through doctrinal language, where pain and punishment were described as necessary means of purification, leading victims to gradually accept harm as part of their personal transformation process. Isaac's commanding role in the confinement system was evident in his control over the entire daily rhythm, from time allocation and access to basic needs, to defining standards of right and wrong, creating an environment where the victim's autonomy was systematically stripped away. Isaac did not merely issue direct orders, but established rules that compelled victims to self-monitor their own behavior and thoughts, a highly effective form of control that sustained power without requiring continuous physical coercion. Investigators determined that Isaac held the central role in victim selection, coordinating punishments, and maintaining internal discipline, showing he was not acting impulsively, but designing and operating the entire control mechanism. Isaac's motives were assessed as a complex mix of a need for power, psychological gratification from dominating others, and a distorted belief in his own chosen role, far exceeding ordinary material motives. The severity of Isaac's criminal conduct was determined to be serious and systematic, not only due to the prolonged duration of confinement and the extent of harm inflicted on Clark, but also because of the repeatable nature of the control model he had built, a model capable of continuing to harm others, if not stopped. The file on Isaac Thorne therefore did not stop at sketching the portrait of a single criminal individual, but clearly established him as a subject who had deliberately created, operated, and concealed a confinement system based on ideological coercion and psychological violence, its level of danger lying in its sophistication, duration, and ability to disguise behavior, rather than in overt displays of violence. On the basis of that identification, the investigation moved into a new focus, establishing the legal value of all collected evidence, to ensure that the proofs not only accurately reflected the true nature of the criminal conduct, but also fully met the strict standards of criminal procedure. This process began with cross-referencing all evidence seized from Clark Thompson's vehicle with the already examined confinement site, where the symbols, ritual objects, and handwritten documents were directly compared to the traces, layout, and ideological elements still present at the location. The match in form, material, usage method, and positioning of these items created a logical chain of connections, showing they were not random objects taken along, but integral parts of the control environment. Clark had described, this comparison was conducted under the supervision of forensic experts and interagency investigators to rule out subjective interpretation and ensure every link established rested on verifiable objective evidence. From that foundation, investigators focused on directly and indirectly linking Isaac Thorne to the confinement site through the presence of evidence bearing his personal imprint and the ideology he had constructed. The seized documents displayed language, thought structure, and conceptual systems that matched Isaac's statements and behavior during interrogation, allowing prosecutors to argue that this ideological system did not exist independently, but was tied to Isaac's commanding role in designing and maintaining the confinement environment. In addition, establishing the unity between the control methods described in Clark's statements, the site layout, and the content of the evidence, showed that Isaac was not merely involved, but the central figure directing the entire space and operational rules at the location. These links were further strengthened by supplementary data on Isaac's presence and activities around the confinement area, helping build a chain of evidence, not dependent on a single source, and minimizing the risk of rejection in court. On that basis, the prosecution file was reinforced by organizing the evidence in a logical structure, with each piece placed in a clear context, tied to the statements, medical conclusions, and established psychological evaluations. This approach allowed prosecutors not only to prove that the confinement occurred, but also to clarify how it was sustained over a long period through a combination of spatial control, ideology, and fear, an important factor in countering any defense arguments that might claim voluntary participation by the victim. The evaluation of evidentiary value for court was carried out cautiously, with consultation from legal experts, to ensure each piece of evidence met the criteria for lawful collection, direct relevance to the criminal act, and persuasiveness to the jury. The ritualistic items, though not in themselves constituting criminal acts, were highly valued for proving context and motive, especially when placed alongside the signs of Clark's physical and psychological injuries, forming a comprehensive picture of the confinement environment. Completing the criminal file was not merely an administrative compilation, but the final refinement process, to ensure the entire chain of evidence truthfully and fully reflected the severity of the criminal conduct, while meeting the rigorous requirements of procedural rules. During this process, potential weaknesses in the file were reviewed and strengthened, gaps were filled with supplementary evidence or expert analysis, to minimize the possibility of successful technical challenges to the file. Once all evidence was confirmed in its legal value, and tightly linked to Isaac Thorne's conduct, the criminal file reached a complete state, ready for prosecution with a solid evidentiary foundation. The completion of the file was not marked by symbolic declarations, but by a firm legal establishment that the harms Clark Thompson endured had been fully identified within the framework of criminal law. Along with an evidentiary system strong enough to hold criminally accountable the individual who designed, operated, and benefited from that prolonged unlawful confinement mechanism. On the basis of that legal foundation, Isaac Thorne's case was transferred to the prosecution phase and officially indicted at the federal level, reflecting the prosecution's assessment that the conduct involved was not isolated wrongdoing, but constituted a chain of organized, prolonged criminal acts that seriously violated personal freedom. The charges brought included kidnapping, prolonged unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy to deprive of liberty, causing serious physical and mental harm, along with conduct related to the use of ideological coercion as a control tool, with each count built on the evidentiary foundation completed during the investigation. The trial proceeded under a strict framework, beginning with the prosecution presenting an overview of the case, clarifying how Isaac Thorne approached, controlled, and sustained the confinement of Clark Thompson, not as a random event, but as a calculated pattern of behavior, maintained through ideology and systematic punishment. During the trial, evidence was presented in logical sequence, from items seized in Clark's vehicle, results of the confinement site examination, to medical and psychological reports, forming a continuous chain to prove that Clark's loss of freedom resulted from coercion rather than personal choice. Clark participated in the trial as a key witness, but the scope of his testimony was limited to pivotal factual milestones already corroborated by independent evidence, to avoid re-traumatization while keeping the testimony focused on core legal value. Clark's testimony was evaluated by the court in the context of expert conclusions, particularly psychological reports explaining why victims in ideologically coercive environments may exhibit outward compliance without it equating to genuine voluntariness. Summoned experts detailed the psychological control mechanisms, how fear and coerced belief erode self-determination, thereby helping the jury understand that the absence of chains or overt violence did not diminish the essentially freedom-depriving nature of the conduct. The defense focused on challenging the objectivity of the testimony and the inferential value of the ritualistic evidence, arguing there was no direct proof of continuous physical force, but this argument was weakened when confronted with the consistency between the statements, the crime scene, and the independently established physical and psychological injuries. The court devoted considerable time to evaluating each group of evidence, not in isolation, but within the overall context of prolonged conduct, emphasizing that the law protects not only tangible bodily freedom, but also the autonomy of will and perception. In the closing arguments, the prosecution stressed that Isaac Thorne's establishment and maintenance of a control system based on belief and fear was the element that heightened the danger of the conduct, because it enabled prolonged confinement without requiring easily recognizable signs of violence, thereby evading detection for an extended time. When the jury deliberated, Aggravating factors were carefully weighed, including the nearly 1-year duration of confinement, the victim's extreme physical emaciation upon reappearance, psychological injuries assessed as likely lifelong, and the perpetrator's use of ideology to legitimize violence. Mitigating factors presented by the defense, such as the defendant having no serious prior criminal record, were not deemed by the court sufficient to significantly reduce criminal responsibility, because the current conduct was determined to be highly intentional, premeditated, and sustained over a long period. The court's verdict was based on the conclusion that Isaac Thorne had committed crimes in a systematic manner, gravely infringing on human freedom and dignity, and posing a potential danger to society, if not met with severe measures. In the sentencing phase, the judge emphasized that the punishment was not only to penalize the individual defendant, but also to send a clear message that using ideological coercion, belief and fear to deprive others of freedom, is conduct that cannot be tolerated in a society governed by the rule of law. The final sentence imposed was 45 years in federal prison, reflecting the exceptionally serious nature of the criminal conduct and the long-term consequences it inflicted on the victim. This verdict closed the trial with a definitive legal conclusion, clearly establishing criminal responsibility for Isaac Thorne and recording that what Clark Thompson endured was not merely a personal tragedy, but a systematic crime that demanded a resolute response from the justice system to protect the core values of human freedom and dignity. After the 45-year federal prison sentence was pronounced, the real-world consequences of the case gradually emerged in a quiet but persistent way, beginning with the long-term psychological impact on Clark Thompson, who faced a recovery process with no clear endpoint. Experts noted that the trauma Clark endured manifested not only in acute symptoms such as panic attacks, insomnia, or involuntary flashbacks, but also seeped deeply into how he perceived himself and the world around him, making once routine activities, like trusting others, participating in community spaces, or making personal decisions, become difficult and fraught with tension. Clark had to relearn how to establish psychological boundaries and distinguish genuine care from signs of manipulation, a process that required long-term therapy and ongoing support, because the fear reflexes formed in a prolonged controlled environment did not disappear simply because safety was now present. Alongside that, the sense of lost time and personal identity created hard-to-name mental burdens, as Clark fully realized that nearly a year of his life had been stolen, leaving a void that no form of compensation or verdict could ever fill. Clark's family was affected no less deeply, because the agonizing wait during his disappearance had disrupted their emotional structure and trust, leaving lingering cracks in family relationships. The relief of Clark's return and the perpetrator's conviction did not erase the months lived in uncertainty, where hope and despair alternated in dominance, giving rise to feelings of guilt and self-blame that many family members had to confront, questions like whether they could have done something different to prevent the tragedy or shorten the suffering. When Clark returned in a state of extreme depletion and profound injury, the family was forced to adapt to a new role, not just as reunited loved ones, but as long-term emotional anchors and support, a responsibility that brought emotional pressure and accumulated fatigue over time. On a societal level, the case produced consequences that extended beyond the individual, because it exposed the danger level of control models based on ideological coercion, models that could persist for long periods without overt violence or obvious criminal indicators. The realization that a person could be confined and manipulated right within modern society sparked widespread discussions about the boundary between freedom of belief and the exploitation of faith to harm others, while at the same time creating an urgent demand on authorities and community organizations to recognize early signs of sophisticated control. The community where the case came to light had to confront feelings of unease and self-questioning upon realizing that silence and outward normalcy could conceal serious violations, forcing society to re-examine support mechanisms, monitoring, and education to protect vulnerable individuals. However, even as the justice system fulfilled its role rigorously, the case also revealed the unavoidable limits of justice, because no matter how severe the sentence, it could not fully restore what had been taken. Justice in this case was expressed through establishing criminal responsibility, preventing recurrence, and sending a clear deterrent message, but it could not erase traumatic memories, undo deep psychological changes, or return Clark to his former intact state of living. The gap between the legal verdict and the personal recovery process thus became where the consequences were felt most acutely, as society was forced to acknowledge that punishing the perpetrator only addressed part of the issue, while supporting the victim and their family on the long road ahead was the true measure of communal responsibility. At the present time, Clark Thompson lives in a state of deliberate withdrawal, a choice shaped not simply by avoiding society, but by a clear awareness of the psychological limits that still remain after the prolonged period of confinement and control. He opts for a low-profile life, limiting exposure to unpredictable environments, because his sense of safety remains fragile and easily disrupted by random factors such as crowds, enclosed spaces, or unstructured interactions. Long-term treatment has become a fixed part of his daily routine, including intensive psychological therapy, regular medical monitoring, and supportive methods aimed at managing post-traumatic stress disorder, with the realistic goal of stabilizing psychological functioning and maintaining self-autonomy rather than expecting complete recovery in the sense of erasing memories. Experts emphasize that the experiences etched into Clark's perception cannot be removed, but can only be processed in ways that prevent them from dominating all behavior, emotions, and life-or-death decisions. Clark did not return to his Uber driving job, a decision reached after lengthy consideration and professional consultation, because that work was tied to the very conditions that once made him vulnerable: contact with strangers in confined spaces, and the feeling of lacking control in unexpected situations, all of which carry the potential to trigger fear responses formed during his confinement. Giving up his former occupation was not merely a career change, but an acceptance that parts of his previous life cannot be restored to their original state, and that protecting his current psychological stability takes priority over pursuing normalization at all costs. On the legal front, the case file has been fully closed, with the sentence in effect and no pending proceedings remaining, ending the prolonged state of uncertainty that once weighed heavily on both the victim and his family. This closure carries significant practical meaning, because it eliminates the risk of unexpected legal developments that could force Clark to confront traumatic details again, while creating at least a minimal stable foundation for him to focus on rebuilding his personal life. However, the closing of the legal file does not mean the psychological consequences have ended, because the injuries Clark carries have become part of his emotional and perceptual structure, influencing how he responds to the world around him. Triggers that seem harmless, such as religious-tinged language, implicit demands for submission, or situations requiring absolute trust, can still provoke strong anxiety and defensive reactions. Clark has learned to recognize these signs within himself, accepting that there are days when emotional control noticeably weakens, and others when it is more stable, a non-linear reality that has gradually become familiar through therapy and family support. His family continues to play a central role in Clark's current life, not as all-encompassing protectors or controllers, but as a safety net that allows him to maintain social connections at a tolerable level. Relationships outside the family are built very slowly, prioritizing trust and psychological safety over quantity or outward sociability, reflecting a realistic adjustment rather than an effort to return to his pre-incident state. Clark does not define his current condition with concepts of overcoming or triumph, but with step-by-step adaptation to new limits, where every small progress holds meaning, but is not seen as a sign that the injury has ended. The prospect of recovery is therefore viewed as an open process with no clear completion point, where Clark continues to live, receive treatment, and adjust, with the understanding that part of the trauma will always remain, but it does not have to dominate his entire being, choices, and values in the present. The story of Clark Thompson directly reflects the very real challenges of contemporary American life, where a modern, free, and highly connected society still contains dangerous gaps into which people can fall if they lack vigilance and adequate support systems. Clark did not disappear because of extreme reckless behavior, but within a context very familiar to millions of Americans, working night shifts, driving for a ride-sharing service, interacting with strangers in confined spaces, and believing that all risks can be managed through procedures and technology. The way Isaac Thorne exploited precisely this environment to approach, drug, and coerce Clark reveals an important reality. Danger does not always come from overt violence, but often appears in the form of sophisticated manipulation that targets an individual's need for meaning, belief, and isolation. The first lesson drawn is the necessity of education in recognizing ideological coercion and psychological control, not only in religious or cult contexts, but in any relationship where power becomes imbalanced. Second, the story highlights the limits of criminal justice. The 45-year federal prison sentence for Isaac Thorne is necessary to protect society, but it cannot erase the lasting psychological damage Clark must carry, underscoring the irreplaceable role of long-term mental health care. Third, the response of Clark's family and surrounding community demonstrates the importance of social support networks, where trust, listening, and early action can make a life or death difference. In today's American context, when many people live and work in relative isolation, the biggest lesson from this story is this: personal freedom only truly holds meaning when accompanied by awareness, community connection, and collective responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from invisible yet equally destructive forms of violence. If you believe stories like Clark Thompson's need to be heard to warn and protect others, please subscribe to the channel and share this video so the message is not forgotten. Thank you for watching until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to delve into the dark corners society cannot afford to ignore.